All right. Well, welcome. My name is Jen. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. And thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, The Great Temperance Times in 19th Century Black Connecticut. Our presenter today, Mackenzie Tor, is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Missouri with research interests in the history of reform movements, African American intellectual history, and the American political culture. Her dissertation, Spirited Struggles, the Black Temperance Movement in 19th Century America, uses Black anti-alcohol advocacy as a lens for understanding the ways race and racism shaped the temperance movement during the long 19th century. Her research has been supported by organizations such as the McNeil Center for Early American Studies, the American Antiquarian Society, the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy, and the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium. And Mackenzie was recently here at the Connecticut Museum doing research, so we're really delighted to hear about her presentation. So welcome, Mackenzie. I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much. And I want to start just by thanking all of the staff at CMCH. I was there back in March, so it kind of feels like a long time ago now, but all of their kind of generosity and kindness with assisting me when I was there and cheering me on as I was like flipping through these pages of these massive record books. It was very nice. So I just want to start by thanking them. And to get started, I will share my screen. Okay, so I want to begin just by looking at the newspaper that served as my kind of thumbnail for today's talk. Into the 21st century eye, this edition, the September 25th, 1841 edition of the Colored American newspaper, might seem a bit odd. It's kind of a mishmash of articles about abolition and education, and as the title of my presentation suggests, alcohol as well. In one column, the paper's Black editor and minister, Charles B. Ray, inserted a history of the Haitian Revolution written by Dr. James McCune Smith, which was a history that kind of retold the history of this revolt on Haiti of enslaved people that led to the world's first Black republic. In another article on that same first page, an anonymous correspondent writing under the pseudonym A Fellow Laborer wrote urging Black Americans to, quote, agitate, agitate until victory is obtained and we stand disenthralled, a free and independent people in the enjoyment of all the rights, privileges, and immunities of American citizens. Elsewhere, the paper advertised anti-slavery societies and meetings to strategize on how to help Black Pennsylvanians regain the right to vote, a right that they lost when the state revised its constitution a few years prior, and also advertising free labor goods, goods that were made without the use of enslaved labor. These columns kind of all present very clearly the mission of the Colored American newspaper, which was to advocate for the abolition of slavery and the equal rights of all Black Americans. In this light, the inclusion of an ad for a Black temperance convention in Connecticut seems a bit out of place. Abolition and racial equality are undoubtedly admired, respectively, as a major achievement in America's national history and an important goal of the American nation. Put simply, very simply, we think of these causes as increasing freedom in the US. But temperance was the movement to abstain from alcohol. And we tried prohibition, and we know how that ended. States lost tax revenues, enforcement was lacking, organized crime flourished, and kind of in light of all of those unintended consequences, we now think of prohibition as sort of a restriction on our freedoms. And in fact, that's how many historians have treated the temperance movement, which was the kind of century-long culmination, or century-long movement that culminated in Prohibition. Historians argue that temperance was primarily a white-led movement ordered towards social control, meaning it was an attempt to reinforce the social, economic, and/or religious positions of a white elite intent on promoting or legislating their own acceptable ideas about morality, in this case, drinking alcohol. So it's interesting in that regard that the Colored Americans editors, who are so passionate about abolition and equal rights, also are rejoicing the achievements of the Black temperance movement, noting and celebrating that the cause was especially advanced in the state of Connecticut. So this poses some questions that I want to kind of work through in my presentation today. Namely, why did this celebrated Black newspaper also cheer the great temperance times, they say, taking place in the mid-19th century Connecticut among African Americans? What was the extent of Black temperance organizing, and to what extent was it reflective of the white goals or the white movement? And so these are some of the main questions that I hope to unravel with you all today, and we'll do so by looking specifically at the rise of the temperance movement in the state of Connecticut. I want to begin with a broad overview of the reform landscape in the state in the early 1800s, and we'll talk about the state's kind of unique political and social culture and also what the limits of that culture were. And then we'll transition by zooming into the story of William Lanson, who is one of kind of my favorite discoveries I came across while I was at CMCH in March. Lanson, I argue, will show us why Black temperance organizing came to be so important. And then, lastly, we'll turn to see how this context bred a rich Black temperance movement in the state, which drew on some elements of Connecticut's religious and political culture, but ultimately appropriated them to serve distinct goals and needs. In the end, I hope to show you that for Black Americans in the 19th century, abstaining from drinking was a demonstrable and tangible step they saw themselves taking on the path toward abolition and equal citizenship. In other words, temperance was really intertwined with these other pushes for equal rights. And so we'll start. To understand the Black temperance movement, it helps to first look at the broader temperance culture in Connecticut in the 19th century. And it's kind of interesting while I was preparing this presentation today, and going over all my notes, I was sort of realizing that all of these like characters I've been studying for the last like decade or so, really, usually a lot of them had some sort of connection to Connecticut, and that was curious to me. And as I've been thinking over this the past couple days, I'm gonna guess and can make this educated guess that the reason for this lies in the state's distinctly conservative political culture in the early 19th century. And we can think about it like this. Generally, after the American Revolution, the story goes that most states begin moving toward a more democratic political culture. Very slowly and in very piecemeal ways, we see the expansion of voting rights for white men. We see the disestablishment, right, separating church and state. And in general, people and politicians beginning to embrace a new rhetoric of equality of the common man that culminates with the election and the presidency of Thomas Jefferson in the first decade of the 1800s. Connecticut, though, was a little different. For decades after, oops, I'll go back. For decades after independence, it was still governed by what historians call the Standing Order, which was a more conservative coalition of Congregationalist ministers and Federalist politicians, often trained at Yale, pictured here, who believed that moral order rather than popular democracy were kind of the foundation of good government. And so while other states were slowly experimenting with new democratic ideals, Connecticut's leaders doubled down on moral authority and social control. Out of this swirl of things, moral reform movements like temperance grew in Connecticut in an attempt to preserve a social order that felt under threat to these elites in a changing and democratizing world. They associated drinking, especially excessive drinking, with working classes, the very people who were coming to assume a more prominent role in American political culture. And because of this, Connecticut's leaders had an early interest in temperance. And in fact, one of the very first temperance organizations founded in the US was the Connecticut Society for the Reformation of Morals in 1813. And one of the earliest leaders of the temperance movement came up amidst this conservative guard. Connecticut's Congregationalist minister, Lyman Beecher, became renowned, among other things, for preaching his 6 sermons on intemperance in 1826, which decried drinking as a sin because it alienated people from God and sunk the nation into moral failure. For reformers like Beecher, temperance was closely tied in that sense to preserving social order, preserving his own status. And it's actually pretty hard to overstate or understate how important these 6 sermons were. They motivate a lot of temperance activism throughout the 19th century. And in my own research, I've seen instances of them being published into the 1900s. So they're hugely influential. And you can see the kind of ethos of Beecher's thinking in this cartoon here, which was sketched by a New Haven artist in 1826. In this cartoon, you'll see one man's consistent decisions to drink throughout the day result in his poverty, his family's suffering, disease, and death. So early temperance reformers framed drinking then as a threat to public morality, and they linked the individual self-control to the health of the republic. In other words, one person's decision to either drink or not drink would have an effect on the bearing of the nation. They see drinking as, or temperance as this collective effort down to the level of the individual. In this sense, in the temperance movement, reformers utilized things such as pledges, sermons, and organizations, societies, to encourage people to abstain from alcohol. And they viewed failing to abstain as a failure of character. So, to answer our first question as to what made this kind of temperance activism so popular in Connecticut, I'd argue that this very distinct, unique, kind of conservative political and religious culture was part of what made this space such fertile ground for temperance activism. Through promoting temperance as a constitutive tenet of citizenship, the Standing Order and other Connecticut elites reinforced their own social, socioeconomic, political, religious positions. But this movement was racialized from the very start. The moral standards that were set by white elites were almost exclusively measured against or used for white citizens, and Black residents were judged more harshly or excluded from these societies. In this sense, the same ideals that governed white reform movements, such as sobriety, public virtue, civic participation, were often used to police Black behavior, creating a double standard. And we can see this through the figure of William Lanson, who was a man born enslaved in Connecticut sometime in the late 18th century and went on to become a sort of jack of all trades. We don't know for sure how he obtained his freedom, whether he fled from his enslavement or purchased his freedom or was manumitted by his enslaver. But according to Connecticut historian Catherine J. Harris, we do know that he was free and living in New Haven by 1803. Once there, he became a real estate mogul, acquiring different properties. He became an engineer, an activist, and community leader. He developed much of the area that is today known as Wooster Square, very famous for its pizza wars. And in that area, he built housing for workers, especially Black workers, established local businesses. He worked on parts of the Farmington Canal, and most crucially to the city's economy, he extended the city's Long Wharf deeper into the harbor, which allowed for more ships and trade to come in and out of New Haven. His importance to the city's early and expanding economy made him a darling of the city's elite originally, in the early 1800s. Commenting on the success of the wharf extension in 1811, Yale College's president and member of the Standing Order, Timothy Dwight, deemed it, quote, an honorable proof of Lanson's character and integrity. But by the 1820s, the city's leadership changed its tune. By that point, the city settlement had outgrown its original 9 square contours. You can kind of see them here. And new industrial workspaces competed for space in Lanson's neighboring waterfront neighborhood, which he called New Guinea, somewhere in that sort of circle there. As New Haven elites tried to lay claim to this space, they painted over Lanson and his developments as vice-ridden parts of the city in need of moral saving. Now, Lanson was no longer a partner to the city's leadership, but rather he was seen as an obstacle to its development, which historian Peter Hinks has shown in his work. A core tenet of these allegations were accusations that Black Americans in New Guinea tippled excessively in unlicensed taverns, groceries, and grog shops. They painted this whole area of the city, populated by Black residents, as immoral. Interestingly, though, this was not the first way in which I encountered or this was the first way in which I encountered Lanson, not as the sort of darling of the Federalist elite, but defending himself against accusations that he had fostered a culture in New Guinea that condoned illicit behaviors. And he defended himself very publicly. In 1829, for example, he published a notice in the city's Columbian Register assuring readers that his grocery was licensed to sell spirits. He also countered attacks that he poisoned a resident by selling spirits, assuring, quote, that I do say and think I can prove that there has not been a man of color that has frequented my store in 3 months that makes a practice of getting drunk. In another publication that I stumbled upon at CMCH, Lanson swore that the reputation he had kind of come to gain and him and his properties became so severe that he reported insistent visits from the city's police force, Constable Jesse Knievels. Sometimes Knievels would visit Lanson's properties up to 3 times in a day. Lanson never learned what the constable searched for, though he presumed that it was probably illicit liquor sales, and in 1848 this resulted in his arrest for keeping a low vial house. Even though Lanson swore his properties were licensed, he was arrested for this charge of keeping an unlicensed establishment, essentially. And so, despite all the heat, Lanson maintained that he always complied with the constable's requests to search his properties, even though there was really no just cause for these sorts of searches. All of this culminated and accumulated so that by 1851, a local Whig newspaper remembered him as a man whose scruples dwindled in tandem with his fortunes. He was, according to the obituary, inherently depraved. With a good education and a good moral training, Lanson would have made a valuable member of society and probably have become distinguished for his talents and virtues, as he was notorious for the absence of the latter. What's really fascinating to me about this is that this is how he's remembered at the time of his death, even as other historians such as Catherine Harris again have shown. Lanson was dedicated to social causes aimed at improving the city. He was a patron of temperance societies, Black churches, and abolitionist groups, all things that otherwise would have made him a standing citizen, but because he had his power within the city in New Guinea, in what's now Worcester Square, had become an obstacle to the city's elite, they began to sort of paint over him with this less savory brush. So ultimately, even someone as prominent as Lanson was constrained by racial prejudice. When he fell out of favor with white authorities, his moral accomplishments offered him little protection. And his story reminds us that temperance was as much about enforcing social hierarchies for white reformers, in this case, reifying white supremacy in the North, and particularly New Haven, as it was about kind of manifesting any sense of personal virtue. Other sources from CMCH corroborate this in yet more explicit ways. For example, by the 1840s, one of the major national temperance organizations in the US was the Sons of Temperance. This was a secretive fraternal order in which men took pledges to support each other in abstaining from drinking. They went out and tried to convert other people to temperance, and the society also operated as a sort of mutual benefit association, kind of insurance for members who paid in and would receive benefits if they ever became unemployed or ill. The Sons had wide appeal throughout the US for a few reasons, but they nevertheless restricted their membership to be white only, even in ostensibly free states like New York, Pennsylvania, and yes, Connecticut. For example, the Sons of Temperance Lodge in Madison, a few towns east of New Haven, debated with another local lodge as to whether they ought to admit Black members in 1850. After pushing the discussion off for a few sessions. They finally had the debate, though with no conclusive result. At their quarterly meeting, the division's leader announced, quote, "The subject of admitting colored persons has been discussed before our division in Whitfield. No decision has been given, enough has been said, and the subject laid on the table," meaning essentially they'd take no action on the question for the time being and continue this practice of segregation in the Sons of Temperance. Likewise, in New Haven's Harmony division of the Sons, the question of admitting Black members comes up only once before the Civil War that I was able to see in the record books. And this happens when a member reads a letter from the state's leadership asking what their thoughts would be on the matter of integrating the societies, or of integrating the Sons of Temperance. Ultimately, they table the discussion and again never bring it back up in their minutes, suggesting that they continue the practice of segregation in these Sons of Temperance societies. So, all that is to say that I think Lanson's experience, along with records from the Sons of Temperance, remind us that even in the Free North, and even within otherwise optimistic reform movements, race placed stark limits on who was welcome to participate in white reform organizations, and by extension, who was considered a good citizen. Even for all his own moral reform and community activism, Lanson was considered outside the boundaries of good citizenship when he brushed up against the desires of white leaders. And so now we'll turn to a kind of final section, because this is, after all, pitched as a talk about the Black temperance movement. And we'll look at the question about what led to the rise of the Black temperance movement in Connecticut and what made it distinct. And here I'm going to argue that if white temperance leaders in Connecticut kind of began promoting the cause as an elite moral project, as an effort by ministers and civic leaders to preserve order and white supremacy in a democratizing world, the Black temperance movement emerged from a very different set of needs. And these were rooted in part in Connecticut's history of slavery. When I teach, students are often surprised to learn about slavery in the North, and this is indeed also the case in Connecticut until 1784, when the legislature passed a gradual abolition law. Under this law, children born after March 1st, 1784, to an enslaved mother would be free once they turned 25 if they were male and 21 if they were female. And something that I actually want to look into, but based on reading the verbiage of the law, is that I don't think this law, once it was passed, actually effectively freed anyone immediately. It was only a promise of future emancipation for someone 25 or 21 years in the future. So, as such, slavery and freedom coexisted in Connecticut kind of uneasily until 1848, when slavery was finally fully abolished in the state. But even with legal emancipation, Black communities faced deep racial inequality in terms of things like housing, education, politics, and employment. And I've laid out some examples of flashpoints in the state's history here, though this is, not exhaustive by any means. And as the story of William Lanson shows us, the sort of rationale for a lot of these measures restricting freedom for Black Americans were rooted, at least in part, in ideas about intemperance and vice being particularly worse in Black communities, even without proof of that. So white reformers, so within this environment, temperance became a language of self-assertion for Black leaders, for Black Connecticuters. In a way, it was a way to take action and claim citizenship for themselves in the face of those rights being withheld by the white elite. For example, one of the most prominent Black temperance activists in the nation was a man by the name of James W.C. Pennington. Pennington was born into slavery in Maryland in 1809 and fled toward freedom in the late 1820s. Along the way, he was assisted by white Christian couples whose faith helped inspire his own conversion to Christianity and eventually he became an ordained minister in the Congregational Church. Though he wasn't officially allowed to enroll at Yale, he did take classes there that resulted in his ordination. He spent a few years in New York before moving to Hartford, where he took up the pulpit at the Talcott Street Congregational Church in 1840, now known as the Faith Congregational Church. There, Pennington became part of an influential and well-organized Black community aimed at increasing educational opportunities for Black citizens, attaining abolition, and yes, as well, promoting temperance. For Pennington, these causes were all deeply intertwined. He saw both slavery and drinking as systems of bondage, one which was sort of physical bondage and slavery, and the other a sort of spiritual and mental bondage and drunkenness. In this sense, dependence on alcohol was seen as a way of restricting one's freedom. And so we see this in this quote I have up here, where he writes that the rum system, like that of slavery, is upheld by ignorance, avarice, and incorrect views of duty. Similar faults, in Pennington's opinion, underpinned both systems. And so by giving in to drink, he argued that Black Americans would diminish their chances of attaining abolition. It was trading in one kind of slavery for another. In his sermons, then, Pennington argued that true freedom required self-mastery. So for Black reformers like him, temperance was a foundation for politics, a way to prove in a world of prejudice that he and others were capable of good citizenship. Some of his other temperance writings shows this. For example, in 1833, he served as chair of the Temperance Committee at a convention of Black leaders in the United States. Like his white counterparts, he urged that Black Americans to adopt total abstinence from intoxicating beverages. However, he understood that this measure had an additional and unique valence for Black Americans. With his committee members, he wrote, "Not that intemperance abounds more among us than among others, for in the face of the declaration to the contrary made by the disparagers of an injured people, your committee are prepared to prove that it does not exist among us, even tons great in extent as among others. But notwithstanding, it more than anything else under our control tends to perpetuate that relentless prejudice, which arrays itself against our dearest interests, frowns us away from the avenues of useful knowledge and of wealth, and which with a cruel hand wrenches from us our political rights." Although intemperance, he's saying here, was no more frequent or infrequent among Black drinkers than others, he explained that it had a weightier effect on the whole of their community if they were seen intoxicated. When drunkenness did occur, it gave shape to justifications for withholding Black rights, as in the case we see of someone like William Lanson. Abstention from alcohol was thus a way to protest prejudice. He therefore believed that adhering to temperance was key to liberating enslaved people from oppression. And not only that, for Pennington and others, temperance was also a key way to make arguments for the return of their suffrage in the state of Connecticut. In this ad for a temperance meeting in 1841, Pennington requests that auxiliary societies bring reports on the status not only of temperance in their communities, but also on employment, education, and what has been done to obtain the elective franchise. This further suggests the ways that temperance organizing was seen as broadly useful for claiming the rights of citizenship, and reveals the ways that leaders saw abstaining from alcohol as essential to building strong communities. Regardless of status, then, Pennington argued that abstention from drinking would have a uniquely positive effect for Black Americans, in that it ultimately was a way of combating anti-Blackness and allowing African Americans to achieve their goal of immediate emancipation and equal rights in the long run. So as minister of the Talcott Street Church, Pennington continued to organize for temperance. He worked alongside peers such as Henry Foster to develop a state temperance society for Black Americans, and as a result, he and others presented sobriety as part of this broader project of racial uplift. Temperance was a claim to moral equality and also a strategy of resistance in a society that equated Blackness with disorder among white people. This brings up another point. While temperance was in some ways a method of pushing back against racism, there was also an endogenous motive here of religion. And we can see this in ministers from the Beeman family, Father Jehiel and his son Amos, who's pictured here. Jehiel Beeman was born free to formerly enslaved parents, and by 1830 he moved to Middletown, Connecticut to take up the pulpit at the African Methodist Episcopal Church there. His sons, including Amos, followed in his footsteps, with Amos becoming pastor at the Temple Street African Church in New Haven in 1841. It's really difficult to, again, overstate the contributions of these two men to the Black temperance movement. Jehiel established the Home Temperance Society for Middletown's Black community and served in leadership positions at temperance conventions throughout the antebellum era, pushing for kind of organizing that became more and kind of bigger and bigger in scope throughout the region. And Amos likewise led temperance conventions and also authored numerous correspondences to the Colored American about the importance of temperance to the Black community. They did this because, well, like Pennington, they believed that temperance was key to Black citizenship and abolition in the short term, but there was also a longer term motive for them of spiritual liberation. For the Beemans, temperance acted on good Christian principles. And you can see here, Amos, for instance, consistently in his writings to the Colored American, repeated this passage from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, warning that drunkards will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. For the Beemans, then, as for many Christians, adhering to the moral guidelines of Scripture would bring them closer to God. But for Black Christians in particular, as many scholars have shown, this faith was often kind of used as a theology of liberation. It was a way to claim moral authority, build community strength, and seek divine sanction for racial justice. In other words, they used their Christianity as a way of pursuing longer-term freedom, finding redemption in the suffering of Black Americans, seeing themselves as God's children rather than society's outcasts, and to kind of see themselves and see liberation as part of God's broader eschatological plan for the universe. By all accounts, then, the Beemans were really important for organizing and catalyzing the temperance movement in Connecticut and throughout the North. And when we reflect back on that article I showed at the beginning of the 19th century, or at the beginning of the talk, during the 19th century, we might say that some of the great temperance times in Connecticut were to be had because of this unique sort of Black leadership here that was very intent on melding Christianity with abolition and equal rights and putting those to the service of organizing. So men such as Pennington, as well as the Beemans, Pastor Isaac Cross, and Henry Foster, these were men who made a lot of active efforts to promote temperance and build temperance institutions in their communities. And so by the 1840s, Black Connecticuter could join any range of temperance organizations in the state, affiliated with different societies and churches. Actually, kind of a lot for such a small state. And I should mention here too that this list is probably not exhaustive. Many Black temperance records have been sort of lost with time. And so these are just some of the organizations I've been able to name and piece together from looking through different newspaper accounts and correspondence, city directories, etc. So when we talk about the Black temperance movement and we think about these societies as a sort of vehicles for the movement in terms of outreach, I hope this gives you a sense of just what the scope was in this one small state. And so I want to make one last point here too. Well, the Black temperance movement was motivated by claims to citizenship and spiritual liberation. For Black women, it could also be an act of feminism. In public temperance advocacy, Black women had a sort of uncertain place at this point in time in the antebellum period. In temperance, was typically depicted as a male problem, while women were considered frontline victims. And I have this cartoon back up here that shows you that. Um, the male, the patriarch of the household, going to work, going to the grog shop after work, spending all his money, and leaving his family to kind of suffer in poverty in this third panel here. In this archetypal family, then, male drinkers would squander their paychecks, leave families impoverished, or worse, they might drunkenly abuse their wives and children, resulting in injury or death. For many temperance reformers, then, women played a key role in publicly asserting the necessity of abstaining from alcohol for improving society, down to the family level, even. This was also the case in the Black temperance movement. At the third annual Connecticut State Temperance Society, for example, the delegates resolved that in view of the moral condition of the people of color, females are called upon to make sacrifices to advance the cause of temperance. This was because, in their roles as wives and mothers, women were seen to have influence over society at the smallest social level, which was the family. In homes, they might influence husbands or children to adopt good habits, including sobriety. But women weren't always welcome publicly in male-led organizations, nor was their public, rather than private, kind of in the home temperance advocacy welcome. Some Black temperance organizations in the North were explicit in barring women from participating, while others, such as one in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, actually promoted women to positions of leadership. So kind of a mixed bag there, depending, I'm going to guess, on local context and other leadership decisions. A final reformer, a Connecticut-based reformer, then demonstrates this. Maria Stewart was a Black woman from Hartford originally who moved to Boston in the 1820s and began speaking publicly on causes such as abolition and women's rights following the death of her husband in 1830. After he passed away, the executors of her husband's estate unjustly withheld her inheritance from her and left her to kind of struggle with poverty and the limited means that women had at the time to sustain themselves economically. This experience motivated her to speak publicly on her frustrations with both white ignorance and male chauvinism, a viewpoint in which sobriety played a key empowering role. We can see this in her 1833 address delivered at the African Masonic Hall in Boston, where she addressed a racially integrated mixed-sex crowd, which different newspaper and press outlets said was promiscuous. However, despite the audience, Stewart directed her remarks specifically at Black men, urging them to do more and use their kind of male standing to bolster the cause of Black liberation. As part of this, she pushed them to, quote, form yourselves into temperance societies. You have been told repeatedly of the glorious results arising from temperance, and can you bear to see the whites arising in honor and respectability without endeavoring to grasp after that honor and respectability also? She continued that nothing would raise our respectability, add to our peace and happiness, and reflect so much honor upon us as to be ourselves the promoters of temperance. For Stewart, sobriety was a rational response to the very real setbacks which Black women in particular faced. She lambasted patriarchy, even pointedly stating in her address that she spoke because men seemed to refuse to. Throughout her essays and speeches, Stewart, like male reformers, claimed birthright citizenship for herself and implored other Black women to do so, urging them to, quote, possess the spirit of men and sue for your rights and privileges. She derided Black men who frequented gambling parlors and dance halls, explaining that tippling drained Black communities of already scarce financial resources. Money squandered on drinks could instead fund schools, churches, or indeed temperance societies. So, by bending these elastic ideas about womanhood and what the kind of proper role of a woman was at this point in time as a mother and as a wife, Stewart used temperance to highlight which she alleged were male failures and also the social importance of female virtue. And she didn't do this popularly. This is an example of someone who receives, a woman who receives pushback for asserting these views and speaking publicly. Because, in fact, observers so detested her lectures on intertwining these themes of temperance and abolition and women's rights that she was sort of forced in some ways to leave Boston following this speech. So, in this way, for Stewart, temperance served as a sort of cloak to advance not only racial equality, issues of racial equality, but also gender parity, showcasing that temperance was actually a really transformative value for Black reformers and for women in particular. So, when we step back and look at Connecticut's antebellum temperance story as a whole, we see, I would say, this sort of microcosm of the nation's struggle over freedom and belonging in the early republic. In the early decades of the 19th century, the state's standing order and its white reformers used temperance to preserve a moral world that they felt was slipping away, a world that was defined by hierarchy and discipline in the face of increasingly in the face of democratizing impulses. For them, sobriety was a safeguard against what they alleged was the disorder of democracy and the anxiety of social change. But even as these temperance reformers preached self-control and virtue, their movement ultimately reflected the racial boundaries of their world. These were limits that excluded Black reformers by casting them as morally unworthy and alleging that they were excessively intemperate and lacking in self-control. But for Black reformers, men and women like William Lanson, the Beeman family, Pennington, and Stewart, temperance meant something entirely different. It was not about preserving order, but about claiming freedom. It offered a language through which Black communities could assert their dignity, build institutions, and make visible their moral and civic worth in a society that refused to recognize it. For Pennington, you see this through the way he entwined slavery and intemperance, arguing that they were twin forms of bondage, one that was imposed by others, but one that was cultivated from within. And both that could only be kind of overcome by self-assertion. In his vision, the fight against alcohol and the fight against slavery were part of the same struggle to make freedom real in both body and soul. On that note, through the Black church, temperance became part of a theology of liberation. The same moral vocabulary that white reformers used to police behavior was, in the case of someone like the Beemans, reinterpreted as a declaration of spiritual and social equality. For the Beemans and their peers, Christian virtue was not a call to submission, but rather it was a kind of call to demand social justice. And for Stewart, temperance was a real way to critique the several lines of her own oppression that she faced in her experiences as a Black woman in America. Through her, we see most clearly the radical potential that Black Connecticuters saw in temperance, the ability to take action by abstaining from alcohol, strengthening community and family bonds with sobriety, and laying claim to the rights and privileges of American citizenship for themselves. When we think about these stories, when we recover them, and we see how Black reformers in Connecticut transformed this movement, often considered one of white moral authority, into a movement of Black empowerment, then we see that there are kind of multiple temperance movements, multiple flavors of temperance, if you will, wrapped up in this broader movement. And perhaps just to leave it here, this might be a kind of interesting paradox to leave it on in terms of Connecticut, that within a culture that was so defined by moral hierarchy, some of the most profound visions of equality and liberation took root among Black reformers. For them, temperance was a key step in a journey toward faith and freedom and the unending work of making democracy live up to its promise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mackenzie. That was awesome. I learned so much. That was really great. So, folks, if anyone has any questions for Mackenzie, please feel free to put them in the chat. I had a quick question regarding William Lansom.
Yeah.
Was it just that the political landscape changed, why he fell out of favor, or was there some particular event?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because it shifts so drastically in terms of the way he's talked about in the 1810s versus in his obituary. Um, I do think that a lot of it seems to be the political landscape. Um, there's also, at this time, generally speaking, a hardening of racial boundaries, I would say. In the aftermath of emancipation, you start to see kind of pushback to that. That takes the form of laws restricting Black freedoms. And so I think he gets swept up in that. And part of that too is this standing order becomes really active in the colonization movement, which when we think of anti-slavery, we think of either being, well, when we think of abolition, we think of being either anti-slavery or pro-slavery. But colonization was sort of this middle tack where people were technically anti-slavery in that they despised the institution of slavery. They saw it as a moral evil, but their solution to it was not immediate abolition. It was actually the removal of free Black people from the United States. And so, in that sense, it's sort of a racist anti-slavery, if you will. And so, a lot of Connecticut's leadership that Lanson is at one point in time kind of communing with and benefiting from relationships with uh, become really involved in that colonization movement. And I, it's historian Peter Hinks makes this argument that this kind of battle over his area of New Haven becomes swept up in this broader push for Black removal. And so I think he's also getting swept up in that kind of political push as well, if that makes sense. But yeah, it's surprising. There's no like one major thing that he himself does that brings this upon him. I think he's just sort of um, almost being swept up in these broader political, cultural trends.
Thank you. We do have a question. Someone is asking, was the idea, is alcohol being drunk at this point because it's safer than water? And how does that play into temperance in the 19th century?
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, alcohol is being drunk at this point for a variety of reasons. Some of it is this, there's no reliable municipal water supplies, especially in cities at this point in time. You think about like, you know, people are using bathrooms in kind of public privies, and so like human waste seeps into groundwater and people at this point in time do have this sort of sense to see that disease kind of can and does at times stem from drinking this water. There's also just sort of like cultural, traditional sort of reasons for this, that it's economically, I guess, um, less expensive also than drinking other kinds of beverages. So something like whiskey at this point in time becomes much, much cheaper and more accessible than even something like I don't know, milk or something like that. So there's all kinds of reasons, but I think water is a definitely a big one. Yeah.
Great. Kendall's asking, it's a little unrelated, but in your research, did you come across any discussion in Black communities regarding temperance as a means to ensure their physical safety? And she's referencing Southerners capturing free Blacks in the North, and if alcohol was seen as making individuals more susceptible to something like that.
Um, Nothing comes to my head. I actually I do feel like I've seen examples of this, but no specific example comes to mind off the top of my head. But it is interesting to note that like a lot of these reformers that, especially someone like Pennington actually becomes, who's this major temperance advocate, is also this really outspoken abolitionist and is also really involved in a lot of these enslaved refugee rendition cases. So, with the kind of fugitive slave law that is in place from 1793 on and then revamped in 1850, under that law, northern states are kind of obliged to use law enforcement to help return escaped enslaved people. And Pennington becomes really involved in a lot of the legal cases to return them. And so it'd be interesting actually to not return them, to fight for their freedom rather. And so it'd be interesting to look and see if, at least in his work especially, he's talking about um, temperance in that kind of light, in that context.
Any other questions? If anybody would like to unmute themselves and ask Mackenzie a question that way, please feel free to do so. Anybody? There are a lot of thank yous in the chat for a great informative presentation. Talking about William Lanson, very undervalued contributor to Connecticut for sure.
I know I had never heard of him until I came across that, where is it, that pamphlet here, and it's really set me down this whole rabbit hole kind of. It's been really fruitful, but
Yeah.
I was kind of like, how have I not heard of him? And now there are all these efforts to kind of publicly recognize him more, including putting up this statue of him in New Haven.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Mackenzie. This was really fantastic. I love it. We were all learning so much. These presentations, learning a little bit about our collection too, which is really, really great for us. I'm going to actually close today by thanking everybody for coming, but I'm going to just mention a couple of upcoming programs that we have at the museum. So Thursday the 9th, we have our Common Ground series, and it's a Growers of Color talkback. And in this conversation, we'll discuss artists that were part of the Growers of Color video series, and they'll address their experiences at the intersection of agriculture, culture, and community. And then next Thursday, we have a date night meant to bean. Bring a date or a friend, and we have a fun evening at the museum starting with a scavenger hunt for our Coffee, a Connecticut Story, that exhibition. And then we will do some trivia, and we'll end the night with some affogato, which is ice cream with espresso. And then our next Lunch and Learn is Tuesday the 28th. Connecticut Soldiers and the Incident on the Massachusetts from 1865. Author Karen Stone will discuss her book about an incident that took place after Lincoln's assassination. The perpetrators, John Wilkes Booth and his accomplice, crossed the Potomac River to escape, and the Black Diamond was sent there to prevent this crossing, but at the same time, the USS Massachusetts was coming downriver carrying soldiers. And so there was quite an accident, and several of the dead were actually from regiments raised in Connecticut. So there is a Connecticut connection to that story. So hopefully you will join us for one of these events. And of course, you can find all of our upcoming programs at connecticutmuseum.org. And Mackenzie, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation today. Please come back when your dissertation is under your belt. We'd love to hear about more of your latest research.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your Tuesday. Bye-bye.